What are the wrist angle faults that cause a slice, and how do you go about fixing them? Well, today, with the help of the HackMotion wrist sensor, I'm going to identify the most common faults that golfers are making when they slice the ball. I'm going to share with you some drills that you can use using the HackMotion sensor, the app, and the biofeedback, and I'm going to help you fix that slice for good. Slice would be defined as a shot that curves to the right of the target significantly for a right-handed golfer. And it's caused by having a club face that's too open to the swing path. Now, there are specific wrist movements that will cause the club face to open excessively, and they're typically demonstrated by the poorest golfers. High handicap amateur golfers tend to demonstrate these wrist angles. So before we get into the fixing of this, I'm just going to highlight the pieces that are incorrect at this time. You need to take a look at the wrist. We're going to deal with the lead wrist in today's video, and we're going to discuss how there are two main ranges or planes of motion. So the first one would be to understand that the wrist moves in a forwards and backwards motion like this. And this movement has specific references. So moving the wrist into this condition here would be called extension. So when you have this cupping or this angle in the back of the wrist, that's extension. And if you move the wrist in the opposite direction, we now have this bowed element to the back of the wrist here. This is called flexion. So we have flexion and extension in this plane of motion. Flexion, extension. And from this side, if you move your wrist, it moves in an up and down fashion like this. Moving the wrist downwards, the fingers downwards towards the ground, would be moving the wrist into ulnar deviation. That would be ulnar deviation, and moving the wrist up towards the forearm would be radial deviation. So you've got ulnar and radial. And understanding the mechanics of that and how those movements work together in the swing to either open or close the club face is really the magic piece that you need to understand in order to fix your slice. A club face that gets too open will have too much extension of the lead wrist, this cupping, and potentially too much radial deviation, which is the cocking upwards. So the extension of the cupping and the upward hinging of the wrists are both pieces that would tend to open the club face. I'm going to highlight the extension that you'll typically see in the poorest golfers who slice the ball. So moving back in the backswing, we'd often see the golf club move into a condition where the club face points more up towards the sky. And already I'm beginning to add extension to this lead wrist, which would be incorrect. The motion of adding lead wrist extension opens the club face. And as I continue to the top, and I get all the way to the top of my backswing, if I have this wrist the most extended or cupped, I'm going to be opening the club face the most. And once you get the club into this condition, it's extremely difficult to then manage the downswing. For most of you, what you're going to see happen is this over-the-top movement. Notice how the club face is still extremely open and pointing up towards the sky. And the only way that you can really deliver this club with any degree of functionality is to swing excessively across the ball. It's that out to in swing path coupled with that open club face which is causing your slice. The correct way to move the wrists in the backswing and the downswing would be to feature more of the lead wrist flexion. So you'll notice here how the lead wrist, rather than being in this cupped or extended condition, is flexed more down towards the ground, and that has the direct influence on the club face, which is now itself pointing slightly down towards the ground. And that's a really good thing to demonstrate if you're looking to reduce your slice. Equally, if I continue to the top, now the lead wrist is much flatter, can even be slightly flexed or bowed, and the club face position at this point is now much more turned or closed. This allows me in the downswing, if I maintain some flexion in this lead wrist, to shallow the shaft, move the club down on the appropriate swing path and swing plane, and get the club back into this delivery point where, again, the club face itself is slightly turned down towards the ground. Having those things in place allows you to turn into the ball and deliver some of the more appropriate features that we look for at impact. Some shaft lean, we're able to compress the ball, hit the ball first and the ground second. A number of the pieces that you struggle to do are completely linked to your poor wrist angles. And whilst it might be tricky for some of you to get your head around, you are twisting this grip whether you like it or not. You're already twisting and moving this club throughout the time and space of the swing. The thing is, you just don't know it. You just take it as read that it's a natural movement for you. So you don't consider for a second that you're twisting this grip in any way, let alone the wrong way. I'm going to show you how, with HackMotion, we can measure exactly what that wrist is doing and teach you the correct twisting mechanism for the appropriate amount of flexion to eliminate that slice for good. So now I'm wearing the HackMotion wrist sensor and I've calibrated it. I now have it open in the app, and we can see that if I move my wrist into extension, that number is going to increase from 0 all the way up to 40 degrees there. That's the extension part. And if I move the wrist in the opposite direction, you'll see that number changes to 40 negative or flexed. So extension and flexion. What we're going to do here is just go ahead and hit a slice, just to show you the pieces at play here. So extension will be added in the backswing, and we'll swing across the ball to slice it. Okay, that was a pretty nice strike, but that ball's curving significantly off to the right there, and extremely short distance. That was 124 meters. My 7-iron would typically go more like 160 meters. So it might be familiar for you. You're losing the ball to the right and you're losing distance, then fixing your wrist angles is going to be something you really want to pay attention to. So taking a look at the data there, HackMotion will show me that at address, I had 24 degrees of extension. That's quite normal. It does depend on how you grip the club as to how much extension or flexion that you'll begin with. But most neutral to good grips would tend to have a little bit of extension in there to start with. But as I get to the top, you'll see that I'm outside the range that is recommended by HackMotion by some 13 degrees. I've extended that wrist more at the top than I had at the beginning, and that's a recipe for disaster. That is a slice waiting to happen. And equally, at impact, my wrist is still too much into the extension, my club face was open, and I hit that weak slice to the right. This is how we're going to go and fix that slice for good. I've now set the HackMotion sensor using the biofeedback tool within the app. This feature allows me to set a range within which I want to move my wrist for optimal conditions. And when I do that, I'll hear an audio feedback. Okay, I'll get some noise coming out of the iPad to tell me that I'm in the correct range. So when I start, I've still got this wrist extended as before, same grip. But as I move back, I'm listening out for that noise to give me the feedback that my wrist is flexed correctly. Now, if I overflex it, point it too much down to the ground, you hear the noise has stopped. If I find the correct range, you'll notice how the club is pointing down slightly, which is what we're looking for. And if I was to make the old swing and extend my lead wrist and roll this club open in the backswing, I'm not going to get any audio feedback at all. So this is a great way for you to train your wrists into the correct amount of twisting at multiple stages throughout the swing. You can train this in the backswing, you can set this number for the top, and you can change it to fit your individual swing and your individual needs. So as your problem changes, your ability to change the range in which you need to move your wrist will also be possible. And that means that you can continue to train and improve your wrist angles forever. So this is how I'm going to practice with the HackMotion sensor. I've set the audio feedback. I'm now going to rehearse my backswing, my takeaway. Looking to keep that club feeling like it points more down towards the ball or down towards the ground. And in doing so, my wrists are staying in the correct condition. Once I've got the feel for that, I'm going to go ahead and hit one. That ball's curved the opposite direction, okay? That ball's curved slightly to the left, meaning I'd certainly changed my wrist angles there. The club face was closed to the path. That ball has got 163 meters versus the 124 meters of my original shot. Managing the club face is the key to good golf, and the only way you can truly understand what you're doing with your club face is via wrist measurement, and the only thing that measures the wrists accurately in the golf swing is the HackMotion wrist sensor. Let's take a look at that shot I just hit and see on the app whether I was able to get my wrists into that range that I was looking for. You'll see at address I was in 23 degrees of extension. The slice swing I was in 24 degrees of extension. So that just shows that my grip, my attachment remained the same. But very different was my position at the top. So I've reduced the amount of extension. I've moved my wrists towards this flexion condition, which, as we know, helps to close the club face. We manage that club face. And then at impact, I'd moved the wrist all the way to 0. So having started with some extension in my wrist, I was able to hit the ball with a completely flat lead wrist, and that's that shaft lean that you would typically see demonstrated by expert ball strikers. It's clear here with data and measurements that I can practice in a way that truly affects and influences my club face to help me hit better, more powerful shots. So to eliminate that slice forever, you need to change your wrist angles. And the only way to know if you're doing it correctly is to measure what's going on. If you can measure it, you can manage it, you can change it, you can see an improvement. The best way to do that, invest in a HackMotion wrist sensor and train using the biofeedback. Your golf game will thank you for it.